destroyed. 2 days after the news of the arrest, the masjid that he only occasionally prayed at was firebombed in a hate crime attack. Okay? The second story is a young man off to the right there. His situation was that he, as well, was a refugee who came to the United States with his family, ultimately came from a broken household, okay, and had mental issues, had substance abuse issues, very similar situations there. He was hearing voices in his head, okay. The mother who was taking care of him was having a lot of different issues. That young man off to the right there tried to turn around his life. Unfortunately, even when he got married, was engaging in domestic abuse. Went off for a little while, left the country, came back, and his situation and problems only continued to get worse. He tried to go to the masjid a couple of times, but when he went to the masjid, he bursted out a couple of times on 2 separate occasions. And each time, he was escorted out of the mosque because he was being so disruptive. The second time that he was asked to leave, they asked him to come back, though, and had a short chat with him, and basically asked him to please refrain from doing these things in the future. Now, what ended up happening was that man off to the right, the FBI didn't come and send an informant after him. Unfortunately, that young man was reading some troubling things online, and he ended up being one of 2 people, along with his younger brother, that planted a bomb on April 15, 2013, at the Boston Marathon, that ended up killing 3 people and wounding almost 150 others. Why do I talk about these 2 situations really quickly? I come to you today partly as an academic researcher, but I also come to you today because I am also a member of the community here, and I've seen situations like this in the past. And so, how then do we as community members address a lot of these things, right? There are going to be fundamental policy issues and civil rights issues that need to be addressed. What I want to just very briefly talk about with the remainder of the time is how we as community members can come together in a spirit of health and healing to help our own most vulnerable individuals to be protected against predators, whether those predators are going to be a potential FBI informant, or whether it is a serious case of someone that's trying to prey on our most vulnerable brothers and sisters, our children, our family members, to do something that is completely un-Islamic and that is completely harmful to our communities. So a lot of the discussion has been around, well, how do we address this? And some people have talked about CVE. That's not what I think myself and some of the other panelists are going to be talking about. What I want to basically talk about is how we can try and come up with solutions that treat our community the same as any other American community here. I am not only an American Muslim, I am also of Latino descent. I am also, my mother is Catholic and my father is Jewish, okay? So aside from the fact that we have all 3 religions in the family, the point that I want to make out here is that my parents themselves lived during a time of the civil rights, where they used to encounter going into buildings where the signs used to say, no Jews, blacks, Mexicans, and dogs allowed. Okay? That was the situation that they had grown up in. And so what I want to be able to do is for our community here that has often been otherized, stigmatized, and marginalized, is to be able to deal with real situations, and come up with real solutions without engaging in narratives that are ultimately going to be harmful to ourselves. And so I have up there an image of another young man. That man is named Eric Harris, okay? He was one of two individuals that had perpetrated the Columbine shootings, high school shootings, about 12 years ago in Colorado. And what's interesting about that particular case is that that young man over there is often thought of as a young, misguided individual who engaged in what has popularly been known as a school shooting. They don't necessarily label his act as an act of terrorism, but in fact, him and his partner, Dylan Klebold, were admirers of Hitler, and they actually stated in their manifesto that they were partly inspired by the writings of Hitler. And yet, despite the presence of a very racist ideology that had partly motivated them to kill their own classmates and terrorize other people, the national response to this kind of an incident was to treat this as a public health issue and not to scream the word terrorism and not to necessarily call for the marginalization of an entire community. And so that's what I want to be able to do then, is address this in terms of public health, avoid the stigma, and essentially treat the issues that I just talked about in the previous slide similar to this thing. Because we are American citizens, and it is, to me, it is not just an issue of public health, but it is also an issue of fairness, that if our white brothers and sisters in this country can get counseling, get put in counseling rather than handcuffs, our own Muslim, black and brown brothers and sisters ought to be able to have that same chance as well. It is an issue fundamentally of fairness as much as it is of public safety and public health. And so just really quickly then, what I had worked on, and that perhaps Brother Salam will talk a little bit more about in his presentation, is something called the Safe Spaces Initiative, which is something that was community-led. It was not government-led. It was not government-funded. This was something that was for the community, by the community. Not a single dime came from a government source. This was something entirely done by the community itself. It is a practical way of trying to be able to get our young people into counseling rather than into handcuffs to protect them in case they're in need of some sort of assistance in times of crisis. And the paradigm here that I'm trying to shift, the conversation that I want us to shift here throughout this entire event and throughout this entire panel is not to talk about issues of threats. What I want us to think about is help, health, and healing. That is the name of the game here. That is what is most effective, and that is the thing that is most ethical, and speaking as a Muslim, frankly, that is probably the most thing that is true to our faith. So there's just three levels here of how the overall blueprint works. There's what I would call prevention, which is sort of nipping it in the bud. It's being able to have things ranging from a good education, things such as like protecting against online predators. They could be informants, but more often than not, you're going to be protecting against people who are going to trick you into becoming a gang member, people that are going to be tricking our young children into getting involved in acts of sexual exploitation, avoiding all kinds of other sort of very predatory behaviors that are there, in addition to instilling a sense of pride and self-worth and self-identity in our next generation. Intervention, of course, again, as I mentioned before, is if you have a brother or sister in Islam, a friend, a family member, that you feel there might just not be something that's quite right there, that something seems to be off, and you want to get them the help that they need. This is about making sure to get them in counseling for that father and that mother who are dealing with their young sons that are in some sort of a crisis. Rather than calling the FBI, or rather than trying to sweep it under the rug, What we want to be able to do then is bring the best and the brightest of our minds, the talent that we have in this community, literally around a table to help get our young people the counseling and the assistance that they need to keep them on a productive path, to keep them on the sirat al-mustaqim in this dunya and inshallah towards the akhirah. And then only, brothers and sisters, if the situation doesn't work out, that's then when we need to step in and maybe call law enforcement, but that is an absolute last resort. We want to be able to provide help and counseling to those who need it, rather than trying to get people involved in arrest. So I'll just sort of end it there. Thank you very much for your time. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.
Thank you very much, Alejandro. Our next speaker is Chris Lavelle. He is, as I mentioned, CEO of Launch Good, and he's going to give us some background from the technical side, the social media.
Assalamu alaikum. I want to share, I don't have a presentation, I'm going to be more anecdotal and talk about my own story. I became Muslim when I was 16. And part of the reason why I became Muslim was I had a classmate of mine, a good friend of mine, now my best friend. He became Muslim, and after he became Muslim, his life turned around and he seemed to become a real man, and I really started to admire him. And at the same time, I read the autobiography of Malcolm X. And I think many people here, I'm sure, have read it or seen the movie, and you're inspired by a strong Muslim man. At least I was very inspired. And I became Muslim. And this was right before 9/11, and I didn't know a lot about Islam, to be honest. I believed in Allah, and I believed that Muhammad was a messenger of Allah, peace be upon him. But someone asked me, for example, am I Sunni or Shia? And I didn't understand the question, right? So as a new convert, someone's very zealous. I wanted to fulfill this amana, this trust of being a Muslim to the maximum capacity. But I don't have the tools yet or the knowledge yet to do so. You tend to latch on to external indicators. So as a young man, what would an external indicator be that someone is a good Muslim?
They pray.
What's that?
They pray.
They pray. What else? A beard. And the longer the beard, the better, right? What else? Thobe. Great. Thobe. What? A third thing for men. What?
Believe on human.
But that's not really an external trigger, right? A thobe is an external trigger. I just look across the room and say, oh, that he's wearing a thobe, mashallah. Right? Or he's got a big beard, mashallah. Or he's got like a kufi, or even better than kufi, maybe a turban. So you could understand my confusion 3 months after converting when the Twin Towers were attacked, and I, for the first time ever, saw this figure on TV named Osama bin Laden, and I was very confused. Because I looked at him, and he's got a thobe, he's got a turban, his beard is the longest beard I've ever seen. He's quoting verses of Quran. And he's living in a cave for the sake of Allah, and he fled from a very luxurious lifestyle in Saudi Arabia to live his life for the sake of Allah. And he's calling to Islam that doesn't make sense to me. And I cried. I remember I seen one of my teachers, Dr. Bajwa here, I actually made my shahada with him. I was with my friend Michael, and I was in his room, and I was crying. I said, I don't understand, like, what am I supposed to do? I was very confused. And I think a lot of the confusion that young people feel today is a similar confusion. I was fortunate, in 2001, there was no ISIS trying to recruit me. There was no FBI trying to trap me. In fact, there was no Facebook, Twitter, YouTube, and none of that stuff existed yet. So in a sense, that gave me a buffer or protection. But there's I think there's some real mental health issues, very much so. There's some real entrapment issues, but there's a real phenomenon happening here that we should be worried about. And even I was talking to one of my other teachers, Dr. Sheikh Ali Suleiman Ali here, about some very bright recruits from Ghana who just up and left their families and migrated to Syria, and they're fighting with ISIS now. And they have an extremely savvy online recruiting system. It's quite terrifying. I've gotten to know it a little bit. They developed a video game very much like Grand Theft Auto, where you blow up American troopers and Iraqi army members, and it goes Allahu Akbar. And it's scary because I used to be a film producer. That's like a multi-million-dollar production. But they're using tools that our kids are used to, like Grand Theft Auto, but using it in a way that recruits for them. They use Twitter, which kids are on, and use it in a way that recruits for them. They use Instagram. When the World Cup was going on, they do hashtag, World Cup 2014, I guess. But then they would just fill it with ISIS propaganda. So they're very, very savvy at getting to our youth. What I really want to focus on, and how much time do I have left?
You've got 6 minutes.
Oh, that's a lot of time. What I want to focus on is why is it even successful in the first place? Like how in the world are our youth even thinking that going off to a group that's beheading people and raping women and enslaving people, like how do they even think that that's not only okay, that's the most Islamic thing. This is the Islamic State, as so they call themselves, after all. Like, what's happening? And to me, one of the challenges, we have to take a macro look and look at history, and that's what the Quran calls us to. فَسِيرُوا فِي الْأَرْضِ فَانْظُرْ كَيْفَ كَانَ عَاقِبَةُ الَّذِينَ مِنْ قَبْلِكُمْ. So go through the earth and look at how the end was of those who went before you. We have to learn from history. And if we look at the state of the Ummah, we're in a very defensive period of our Ummah, a very defensive period. We don't have a state that represents us like the Caliphate of the Uthmanis. We don't have any really representations of the Islamic government in all honesty. And to a large sense, Islam has been neuterized, or neutered. So it used to be, if you read, for example, this very good book about Commander of the Faithful, Sheikh Abdul Qadir al-Jazairi, a very famous leader of the Algerian Revolution about 100 years ago or so, fighting the French occupation. And he was a Sufi and a saint, a very spiritual man, but also a very religious man and a warrior fighting for the causes of people. And now Sufism has been relegated to being like sort of pacifist and very peaceful and not engaging. And this is one example. But I think what's happening with a lot of our young people is they look at Islam today and it's irrelevant and it's always on the defense. In their communities, we're always apologizing, we're doing all these interfaith events, we're trying to get people just to accept us. And a lot of young people say, no, I want an Islam that's strong. I want an Islam like Umar ibn al-Khattab, like Ali ibn Abi Talib. And they can't find it in their communities. And where do they find it? They find it online. They find it, unfortunately, in ISIS. They see ISIS is on the offensive right now. And because they're on the offensive, their recruiting is through the roof. They get thousands of people coming from all over the world to ISIS every month. Thousands of people. It's scary. It's really, really scary. And I think we underestimate the intelligence of our youth. Imam Ali, may Allah noble his face, he said that youth is a kind of madness. And we know that teenagers can be very irrational, but they're not stupid. If you look at the 3 young girls that came from Birmingham to join ISIS, they were 15 and 16, I think, and Anisha will talk about them. It is very complicated to get from Birmingham down to Syria, and they're only 15 years old, and they did it. They found the money, they found the tickets, they were able to use their older sister's passports. It's very complicated, and they did it. They pulled it off. They're not stupid, but they're easily impressionable. And another point to make, and it is a very practical takeaway for families here, when we talk about strength, they're looking for strength in Islam. They're looking for an Islam that is proactive and strong. A trend that I see amongst many of the converts that join and the young teenagers that join ISIS from the West at least, is within their own families, they're lacking that from their fathers. So I think, again, maybe Anisha may talk about it. I think 2 of those girls didn't even have fathers in their life. Many of the converts that you've seen, like from Canada, there's a couple white converts, they didn't have fathers in their life. Or the fathers that are in their lives have a very, they don't have a strong traditional male role in their household. And again, a young Muslim wants to live Islam, wants Islam to feel relevant and powerful and engaging, they can't find it in their community or even their own household, and it makes it very susceptible for them to fall into the traps of ISIS, for example. And I'm going to end early, I think, even if I have some time here, and I look forward to the questions and answers, but I hope as a community, and we have it, and definitely in a lot of pockets, but we can continue internally to see Islam as something strong and something powerful, and we develop our own self-confidence. If we have that self-confidence, our youth won't be looking to run over to Syria to find it, inshallah. Jazakumullah khairan.
Thank you, Chris. Our next presenter is Anisha Patel. She is a global education expert, and she's going to talk about these issues from an educator's perspective.
Thank you so much, Junaid. Assalamu alaikum. So you might think to yourself, how does this word proactive recruitment of and ISIS and education, how does those both go together or in the same sentence? But I'm here to tell you as an educator that really they do go together. And today we're here to talk about proactive measures. How can we protect our youth? And a lot of what Chris and Alejandro have already talked about and what Salam is going to address as well is really how can we make sure that this is not happening? The three girls that Chris just had mentioned are the Beutel girls from London, right? And they're 15 years old, 16 years old, and they were star students in their school, right? They're very intelligent girls. They're they were in debate team. One of the girls was a debate team, really good at it, and one was really good at sports. So what was the desperate need, or why did these girls feel like they need to leave their families? Now I have 4 children. I have a 12-year-old as well, and my younger children. But to leave their parents at the age of 15 it's not an easy thing. Why do they feel that they have to leave and go to Syria? Why do they feel they have to leave England and go to Syria? Why do our youth here, and we have many examples that Chris was talking about, right here from the States, leave their families, their moms and dads, and go and help ISIS? So this is where education falls in. And the 2 areas that I'm going to be talking about, the proactive measures, is really how can we as schools and as an education system help with this situation? How can we as parents help with this situation? And then as a community, because this is going to need a wraparound kind of proactive measures holistically. And the cause that I'm going to talk, because this issue is so complicated, but as an educator, and having had so much experience, 23 years experience in education, working with students, working with school systems, and working holistically with school districts and leadership, I'm going to be talking about the lack of sense of belonging that Chris had alluded to, and even this sense of growing Islamophobia. And what can we do as far as the proactive measures, as far as really nurturing a sense of global citizenship in all our schools, both private schools, Islamic schools, but also our public schools, okay? And really getting these school systems to make sure that they acknowledge our cultural identity and faith identity of our students. Because as an educator, we know, and as parents we know, that everybody needs, children, youth, they need to make sure that learning for them is relevant. And to make sure that we meet their needs, we have to meet their cultural needs as well. In schools, they're very, very acute, they're very aware of this. But in America, sometimes in schools, there's a separation of church and state. So they say, oh my gosh, we can't talk about faith in schools. But no, we know that our faith, Islam, is very much a part of our life. So we cannot separate culture and our faith. They go together. So we're going to talk a little bit about that and really building a mutual understanding and respect for all our children. Now, when I go into school systems and I work with school districts, public school districts and private school districts, my message to them is cultivating global competence it's an essential skill. And it's not a luxury learning add-on, And what do I mean by global education? Global education means having cultural, having our students coming out of our systems to be culturally competent. Because our students today sitting in our classrooms, they're not going to just be interacting with each other. They're going to be interacting, we're in a global market. They're going to be interacting with people across the world, and even there's such diversity right here. So just to be able to relate to each other, you need that cultural competency to understand different people, different faiths, different language backgrounds. And for us to have the most amazing students, world-class students, we need to have to have this strong message to them. And now schools, if you, how many parents do I have in the audience here? Oh, good. Okay, lots of parents. And how many Islamic school teachers here? Okay, good. As school teachers, you hear a lot about 21st century skills. And when we go into the schools as parents and teachers, really to say global competency and religious inclusivity in schools is very much about 21st century skills. So it's not like we're telling anybody to do anything differently. I'm going to talk about 2 case studies, right? I work in large school districts here in Chicago area, and I started working with a school district that is pretty much homogeneous, but they have a growing diversity. And I started working with their leadership team, the superintendent and the administrative staff, and every principal of every building, talking about the importance of why should they, when it's Eid, when it's Ramadan, or Diwali, or any other holiday, when our students are walking into the school building, why is it important for the announcement to say Happy Eid, Happy Ramadan, Happy Diwali, any other holiday? Because what's happening in our schools is mostly what our kids are hearing is, at December time, there's lots of festive activities going in our schools, but at other times there isn't. So what message does that send to our youth? So the sense of belonging that Chris was talking about earlier, that kind of gets kind of jaded a little bit, being like, okay, I'm an American, because our kids, we're all American, right? We're American Muslims, and I'm in the school, and how come my culture is not being addressed? And at Christmas time, there's so much going on, but at Eid time, nobody said Happy Eid to me. So even a small message like that, what are we saying to our students? So really, I talk to the principals and the superintendents and CEOs, like even of Chicago Public School District, for instance, about the importance of having this peace and really for the teachers to understand all faiths and Islam, for them to really understand Islam so that they can meet the cultural and religious needs of their student population. Then I'm going to talk about an exemplary Islamic school, Tawhid al-Islam in England, which I was really excited because this Islamic school, just like what happened in the public schools that I'm working with, where they're instilling global education as a central philosophy, this Islamic school has global education as a central mission in their school. So they make sure that everything they do in their school, even if they do in Islamic school, they have, of course, faith, religious studies, and they don't just study Islam. They study all religions, because what we want to get across to our students is that there's our neighbors of different faiths. There's members of our family, like in Alejandro's family, that are of different faiths. And it's really important to have respect and mutual understanding. So even in an Islamic school, their major principles are surrounded on global education. So I want to take these 2 examples that I'm talking about for our Islamic schools here in the States to really work on this philosophy and this mission, and our public schools too. So let's start with schools. How can schools be proactive, right? So I've talked a lot about this, but the major end result is that when they're going into schools, if they speak a different language, different culture, different faith, we want them to have a strong sense of belonging. This is my America, not this is my America, I'm not happy with it and I need to leave because I just don't feel a sense of belonging here. That I need to leave my parents and get a fake passport and head out of Dodge here. That we want them to feel this is my America and I'm going to contribute to it and I'm going to make it a better place, right? Every Muslim student, every student. And as parents, this is where it comes in. It's a scary thing, right? For the 3 girls that I showed you, the 15, 16-year-old girls, their parents, can you imagine? Put yourselves in their shoes. What are those parents feeling? They have lost their children. They cannot communicate with their children. They're scared that even when their children email them, is it their daughter emailing them or is somebody sitting there emailing them? They have lost a child. So for us, we all have to kind of stand up and say, okay, what is going on, and what as parents can we do? Well, the number one thing we have to do is we have to be the advocates for our children who are attending public or private or Islamic school, to say, look, really, what are you doing as a school? Because as parents, we have rights in schools. That's why they have PTAs, right? Parent-Teacher Association. As parents, we want to make sure our voice is heard at school. And you should not be shy. You should not be back away. You shouldn't say, okay, because I'm not in education, I don't understand the school, so I'm going to keep quiet and let them do their thing. No, because as a parent, you have to be, it's our job, we have to be the advocate for our children. And really, we have to ask them the questions, say, what are you doing about cultural competency? How are you going to meet my child's needs? And how are you going to make sure that she feels a strong sense of her heritage being appreciated? And how can she share her heritage? And talk about your child's cultural background. You know, every year I go into my child's classroom, and if I don't go, then my kids always say, hey mom, what happened? So every Ramadan I go and do a Ramadan presentation, and we have fun with that in the classroom for my children. And I recommend that you really go into your classrooms and to your child's classroom and talk about it and have fun with it. And then even as far as what can we do as far as at home, right? At home we really have to make sure that we're developing a trust and open communication with our children. Really, what are they doing? What are they talking about? Who are their friends? Because these three girls, how did they gang up to go together? They were at school and they became really good friends, and so the peer pressure kind of is a big factor, right? So have open communication and really nurture this positive sense of identity and encourage them. And you as a parent have to be a good role model as far as showing them that you're giving back to your community. You're a good neighbor to all your community, Muslims, non-Muslims, everybody. That you are an American and you're here to make this a better place. And share with them the wonderful examples of the Prophet. You know, my kids love hearing Prophet stories and Allah stories, and my husband does a great job doing that with them as well. And to share these wonderful stories. And one thing, I always hear sometimes my kids will go to Sunday school, they went to Sunday school, and they'd say, hey, you know what, my teacher said at Sunday school that I shouldn't be friends with non-Muslims. But to really encourage friendship with all faiths, because that's when they interact with each other, that's when they understand each other. And many times, the statistics show that there's 40% of Americans out there who do not know a Muslim and have never interacted with a Muslim, and so then they have negative feelings about Muslims. So as soon as that interaction happens, then they were like, oh wow, you know, Muhammad over there is just like my friend Bob and has the same kind of common values. So to accentuate those common values. And my last slide, and then I'm going to end here, is that as a community, we really have to wake up. This is an issue, and we have to wake up and really encourage. And you know, those statistics that I was sharing with you earlier, as far as 4 in 10 Americans don't know a Muslim personally, we have to change that. We have to make our youth and ourselves ambassadors of our faith, and our youth really have to go out doing the dawah as well. And one great way of doing that I found as a parent and as also a non-for-profit leader is to encourage in our community, when we're doing civic engagement, right, and charity activities, not just for our Muslim causes, but non-Muslim causes as well. And to work with, say, the Jewish women or, you know, or other Catholic groups and do charity projects together or do sports together, but have structured environments where our kids can interact with each other and get to know one another. So once again, to branch out, there's so many as far as a parent, as an educator, and as a community, we have a lot of work to do. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Anisha. And our last panelist is Salam Marayati, who's the president of the Muslim Public Affairs Council.
Assalamu alaikum. I think pretty much everything's been said, but not everybody has said it. So I will try to be very brief, because we also want to get to your questions and discussion about this very important topic. ISIS tweets about 90,000 times a day. Some studies have indicated. And the response or the counter to it is negligible. There is now some movement in countering the response, but it's still very little. In fact, one of our scholars who's here at ISNA, Yasser Qadi, received a death threat from ISIS. I believe it was on social media. And so this actually is indicating a battle of ideas of where Islam is going in the future. And we have to be very stark in the contrast in terms of the battle of ideas. Because what is happening with some of the kids that are getting lured into this trap of ISIS, making them think that this is where they should go, it underscores a couple of problems. Number one, there is an identity crisis among these young men, mainly young men and some young women. They do not understand what identity they really have. And so when they don't feel they have an identity, then it is easy for groups like ISIS to fill that vacuum. That they present themselves, ISIS does, as the khilafah, as the pure state, as the place where you will get respect from other Muslims. And so an identity crisis is important to look at in terms of this issue. Number two, and I think this points to, I think what Anisha was talking about in terms of gangs and gang violence. It's very similar to gangs and gang violence. Gang violence takes place because they recruit young men to join a cause where they feel a sense of belongingness. And that is exactly what ISIS is providing. It is that sense of belongingness. And so again, ISIS is saying, come and join the cause. You will get respect. You will live in purity. And even though we know it's a facade, we know that these are just lures, and really there's moral bankruptcy in what ISIS is actually doing when they kill more Muslims than anyone else. They enslave people and unfortunately use women for sex slavery. But what is our counter? In other words, what are we doing here to deal with this problem? And this exposes one of our challenges in our mosque communities. And I would posit that community programming, especially youth programming in our mosque communities, is at an anemic level. We are not doing enough in terms of youth programming. That leads to confusion about identity, that leads to a debate over where Muslims belong in society and whether we belong here or not. Whether that is going to connect them to ISIS or not, that's another issue. But we're dealing with some root causes that are serious ones that leads to antisocial behavior. If not a state of confusion in terms of their identity. And so we have to look at ways to infuse mosques and communities with resources. And the resources are more programming and possibly providing mental health support and religious counseling. And these kids that are joining ISIS are not necessarily in the mosque community, but maybe somebody knows somebody who knows someone who is thinking about joining ISIS. And the question is then, how do we get to that person that needs help? I'm not talking about the possible recruit, but I'm talking about the mother or the father or the friend or the mentor that they are confiding in. Where does that person turn to for help? Where are the resources we're providing them? And that's what we mean by proactive measures. And yesterday there was a debate whether we should or should not. I think once one of our scholars gets a death threat, I think the debate should be over. We need to intervene in the situation. We need to do something about the situation. And so as Alejandro says, we have safe spaces, which is prevention, basically, means healthy American Muslim identity, making the mosque community a center, really going back to what the Quran says. making the mosque a center of where we discuss the Quran and applying it so that we bring people from darkness to light. The mosque is now a community center, not just where I go and listen to a khutbah and afterwards I say, you know, Junaid, that was a great khutbah. And that's the extent of my interaction with the mosque. Or I usually would say, that was a lousy khutbah. And we need to get better khatibs. And, you know, that's the extent of the engagement with most mosques. And so think about what young people are thinking. If we're having issues in engagement, then they have even more issues. And that's why you see when you go to mosque, either you see kids 4 and under or adults 50 and over. You don't find that young people that are joining a cause. And it reminds me of a case in Virginia where these kids went to Pakistan to join one of these extremist groups. And then the imam of the mosque from Virginia said, I don't know why they went, because we don't discuss politics in our mosque. Well, that's part of the problem. We have to start discussing the hot issues. And if it means we discuss Palestine, or Kashmir, or Chechnya, or drone strikes, that's what needs to be discussed. And more importantly, how people can be engaged in some kind of solution towards those problems. Let them join these causes inside the mosque so they're not lured to these false causes outside the mosque. And so these are some of the issues that we're talking about. I have a lot more to say, but I want to leave time, as I said, for questions and answers. But the bottom line is, brothers and sisters, is that we have to be proactive. If not, we are only going to react to more crises in the future, and the numbers will just keep growing. And it's time to just end the debate and let everybody figure out something they can do about this issue and provide resources and tools to help develop a healthy American Muslim identity for all of us, and especially our youth, and to treat this issue, as Alejandro said, with love and respect towards young people, not as quote-unquote threats. Thank you, Salam.
Excellent. Okay, thank you very much to all of our panelists, and thank you for being here for this. We've got 10 minutes. We're right on schedule for Q&A. We wanted to have written questions. Has anybody put those together? And what I'd like you to do is go ahead and form a line here, and that way I'll know how I can equitably ask you to ask your questions, and I won't skip anybody. We've got 10 minutes, so we've got one person right here stepping up. So,
not written? Oh.
Go ahead.
Okay. Yeah, I have a question for the panelists, because I think that what's being argued is also contradictory in some ways. So, for example, the Safe Spaces Initiative actually, in its documentation, discourages Know Your Rights trainings by saying that it actually is not conducive to relationships with law enforcement. Know Your Rights is a very, very basic civil liberties question that every organization and community in the United States uses, and it's a constitutionally guaranteed right. My second question is, Salam and Marayati says we need to encourage more politics and more debate. Now that actually runs counter to the Countering Violent Extremism program and its radicalization theories, which actually says the more Muslims talk about politics, the more they engage in social activism, the closer they are to being terrorists. That actually is a way in which they target Muslims. And I actually think that in some ways there is an underestimation of FBI informants. I think that ISIS also uses as a recruiting tool the fact that Muslims are unjustly arrested and prosecuted by this government, and because we don't actually stand up for people like Tariq Muhanna, like Sister Layla Yavi's, a son who came back from Jordan, and that was used to prosecute him. I think that if we don't actually do that, if we don't actually challenge Islamophobia and those who are unjustly imprisoned here, we're not actually getting to the root of the cause. And we have to talk about the couple in Mississippi that was targeted by an FBI informant as well.
Thank you for your statement. I'm going to say one thing before I let them respond. This is not a session on CVE. This is a session on what we can do proactively as a Muslim community, as parents and as educators and community members, to protect our children from recruitment online, whether it's from an FBI informant or from a recruiter from a terrorist organization here or domestically or internationally. So I want to be very clear about that point. Do any of the panelists want to
Actually,
respond?
I'd rather hear the other question, and I'll talk to the sister offline after the.
All right, great.
Salam alaikum. I'm here with the Institute of Youth Development and Excellence. I'm making this point, my director's sitting there, and I was so glad to hear you speak on the topic of being proactive as far as being parents and at the masjid. The reality is that there are programs like our program, which is designed for mentorship. We train mentors. We establish a product in the community. The problem is always financial. And there will always be that problem with the masjids making that decision of whether it's worth investing $5,000 or not. Sometimes after a child dies, maybe they realize that it was worth it. Some of the work our mentors do is triage. As you were saying, we need to have people who are able to say, okay, where is this going? Let's send them for a special treatment. But the question is, I would like to know, why is it that people who seem very engaged in this conversation are not actively supporting us and saying to the masjids, and why is it that we're not telling the people that they need to be very proactive in going to their board events and demanding of their masjids to have the services be given out? Because the money is not being put out.
So does anybody want to respond?
Well, I think the short answer to that, again, we can discuss this further, is that we need a whole reorientation of our mosque communities in that kind of program, and make that a priority as opposed to spending $10 million on brick and marble and how big the dome and the minaret and importing stuff from overseas. All the money goes there, but not enough goes into programming. And what I suggest to you, sister, and we can discuss this, is if we can't find from the community, then let's look at public funding. Those are our tax dollars. Other communities get it. When I talk about gang violence prevention, they get a lot of public funding for their programs. And if we're doing boys and girls clubs and mentoring and all that, I see that as a perfect opportunity for public funding. So please don't lose hope. There is a way. There's a solution.
So we have 6 minutes left, and we've had long questions and even one big statement. So if you could just, quick question.
My name is Anisha, I'm from Voice of America. I just want to know why ISIS become the biggest threat and not for the Taliban. And the second thing is, do you consider that American youth is also prone to that much to go to the ISIS as the European countries, Muslim youth?
Thank you, great question. So why is ISIS the biggest threat? A lot of different reasons, but I think really in large part that has a lot to do with the history of foreign policy and the consequences that have resulted from that. And I think that's one of the big elephants in the room that needs to be part of the discussions. When Salam was mentioning before about how we have to have these political conversations in the room. And one of the things then that needs to be a part of these conversations is that we not only acknowledge that there are legitimate grievances that are held not just by our young people, but by our communities and even shared by many other members of American society at large, but then we also need to show them a constructive path through the ballot box, through democratic means of activism, not through bullets, which is what ISIS is showing them. And as for American youth, I don't think that they are prone to this kind of a thing, because that suggests something that is very problematic. Our youth are a potential resource, and they are a next generation of leaders that are going to be a part of our community. There are, unfortunately, some small number of individuals who have gone off and done certain things. The reason why we're having this conversation is in part because, alhamdulillah, there hasn't been more that's been done, or there haven't been more people that have been sucked into this kind of a thing. And ISIS is trying very hard, very, very hard to do that kind of a thing. So we want to not only count our blessings, but we also then want to make sure that we are working towards protecting our youth and showing them a better path through the Sunnah and through the Quran, as opposed to ISIS's cult of death.
Excellent. Does anybody else on the panel want to respond? right, next question.
Just quick comment and question. I believe we are suffering from crisis of interpretation here. Evidence from the Quran and the Sunnah have been used by those criminals to support their actions. And this is why the West is building a case against us as Muslims. Do you think that imams and religious scholars, Muslim scholars in this country, are we getting carried away with religious uniformity? We start calling people, this is a Muslim, this is a kafir, this is a mu'min, rather than preaching like religious diversity and tolerance. The second question, are we carried away with the concept of Islamic State? You know, we see our imams and the members, some of them, they always make a dua for establishing the Islamic State. Did the Quran call upon us to establish Islamic State? Because what's happening, some of these terrorists...
We have two questions, so...
Five questions.
So thank you.
I think the short answer, again, because the underpinning of your question is we need reform in our understanding of Islam, because there is nothing about the Khilafah in the Quran. The Prophet didn't say you have to have a Khilafah, yet people are thinking that this is a religious obligation. Nothing about killing an apostate in the Quran. In fact, it talks about a person who leaves Islam, comes back, and then leaves, come back, and can't come back again. So how can you come back if you're supposed to kill him? So there's contradictions in that. Therefore, we should demand from scholars and thinkers that there has to be a consistency, not of this text to modern era, but of the text to the mission of the Prophet ﷺ, who was what? A mercy to humanity. And he came for justice. So let us demand reform for what the Prophet ﷺ said, and all this talk about Dar al-Islam and Dar al-Harb and kill the kafirs and all that, this should be washed away. And if it means we have to start from here, because there's too much baggage in the Middle East, let's start the reform talk and discussions here in America.
Be very, very succinct about this. Religion can definitely be a part of the solution, for sure, and I think Salam has already articulated some of that. But I also just want to be very cautious here to say, though, that we don't want to overplay the hand of the religious element here as well. Religion is part of the solution. It is not necessarily the problem. It is more often used as a pretext to justify certain people's pre-existing political whims and desires and take advantage of other people's underlying identity issues, mental health issues, and other things that are going on that also need to be done to help just build a healthier community there. So again, I just want to emphasize here that religion is not what's being hijacked. It's Muslim grievances that are being hijacked here. It is not Islam that is being hijacked. And so, but that said, though, is that with understanding that religion itself can very much be a very important part of the solution.
Very good. So we're out of time, but what we'll do is we'll have each of the folks that are standing in line go ahead and ask your question, and then we'll try to do like a speed round of answers. Okay, that way it's equitable.
I won't take more than 30 seconds. Assalamu alaikum. And one thing that I saw missing from the presentation today is why our kids act this way. If you want to know that, you need to understand the physiology and psychology. The physiology is in a young kid, the temporal lobe does not work, it works in adults. So they don't understand the consequences of their action. They have hormonal changes, which creates an identity crisis, and so does the peer pressure. Now, these factors will lead to identity crisis. It will
Sir, do you
lead
have a
to...
question?
No, this is a comment.
Okay, no,
because
so,
that's
we want to give everybody an opportunity to ask questions. Thank you.
Thank you.
Forgive me if this was already covered. I was wondering if there are warning signs that children are vulnerable to influence by ISIS or other violent groups.
Okay, that's one question.
I think you all shared some great information, but I would love to walk away with some very concrete action items that I individually can take around this and engaging family and community and young people. And I just would like to hear that succinctly put together in the end.
Okay.
Okay, we just want to know who ISIS is. Can you describe how come they came to power in a so short time? That's my question.
Sorry, I snuck in at the last minute. My quick question is, coming from a different cultural background, having immigrant parents who are my cultural background, and my kids are no longer part of that immigrant cultural background, how do you feel that we can get to the next step, to knowing what our kids need, knowing that they're coming from a different identity, a different cultural background? So that's what I would like to hear, is how do we include them in the conversation of how to change things? Does that make sense?
Okay, so I want to take a crack at these questions.
I think I'll just speak quickly to the last point. I believe as immigrant parents, I'm not an immigrant parent, but immigrant parents have a choice of trying to preserve their children's cultural identity or religious identity. And I think the more we invest in preserving their religious identity, bringing them to investing in time and money to bring them to things like ISNA, to concerts like Native Deen, to experiences where they get to meet, for example, Abdullah Hussein or Hussein Abdullah, NFL football player. Those are the things that help build their cultural identity as American Muslims. And it's a melting pot, but in the 15 years that I've been Muslim, I'm definitely seeing it's moving in the right direction.
I'm going to take my buddy Sarah's question as far as practical tips, and let me move to this side. So as far as practical tips, I think what we have to do with our children, each one of us, as schools, as parents, and as a community, is really instill in them a pride of being an American Muslim. To say, okay, there's no shame in our game of who we are. To really walk tall, to say, okay, I am an American Muslim, this is my country, and I'm going to give back to this country, and for them to build strong relationships. So if I go back to this slide, as far as what can we do as far as parental advocacy in schools, what can we do as parents to build that relationship with our students, and the activities and events we should nurture in our home, and the ethos we build in our home for our children, the messages we give to them to really work on them. And there's, and for the sake of time, we'll have coffee and talk more about this too, sir.
There's the other toolkit. I don't know who asked about practical, but we have a program that Alejandro referred to, called Safe Spaces, and we'd be happy to do a presentation of Safe Spaces to your group. It provides methods and resources for the prevention and intervention that we've been talking about. So we'd be happy to do that. And then as far as just, in a quick response to the concerns about something that was in there about know your rights, the point about know your rights is what we're saying is, if that's all we're telling communities to do, that's not enough. We have to engage law enforcement. In fact, we believe that the healthy relationship with law enforcement will help mitigate some of these problems of entrapment, espionage, surveillance in our communities. And if we want to change the CVE policy, which some of us on this panel have done, we have to engage the government to change the policies that impact our communities. And in fact, we have always gone to the government saying, you have to get rid of any kind of radicalization theory. Like, if a person grows his beard, that means that he might be getting radical. Or if he wears a thobe, or if he does that, this and that. These are not indicators. The mother, the father, the friend, the mentor, they know when there's something wrong where they need help. And our job is, how do we provide the resources for that help? The last thing I want to just say is, to be involved in is gun violence in America. When you talk about Charleston and Chapel Hill, as well as Chattanooga, all involve gun violence. And those guns in the wrong hands led to the murder of 3 Muslims in Chapel Hill, the murder of 9 African Americans in the Charleston church, and 2 or more people in Chattanooga by a Muslim. So gun violence is also something we need to be aware of and involved in as an American issue.
So we're out of time. I want to say, first of all, you were given a yellow like evaluation card, or if you have the app, the ISNA app, please evaluate the program on that and share that with us. So in closing, one thing we said at the beginning was that this is a 1-hour panel to talk about some of the issues and start thinking about what we can do. It's very, very challenging to come up with any answers in 1 hour. So I think that the panelists have done a great job in sort of highlighting the things we need to talk about as we go forward. So thank you very much for attending.